A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime Daily, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case that they worked or that they lived through. Some are high profile, some you have never heard of, but they are all fascinating. Today's case would have likely gone unnoticed because the murder victim was an elderly homeless woman, but that woman, who remained nameless to so many who walked by her or drove by her, was actually a soul singer from the 60s who recorded records in Hollywood with some very famous people. Her name was Betty Jane Willis, and at the age of 76, she was sexually assaulted and killed on New Year's Day of 2018. Though her alleged killer was caught practically in the act by police and arrested, this case has not yet gone to trial. There is one journalist who's been working tirelessly to focus attention on Betty's case and the lack of justice. Joseph Fenity is a journalist, an award-winning podcast host, and a documentary producer who has written extensively on Betty Willis and has an amazing article in LA Magazine. Welcome, Joseph. We are so happy that you're with us today.
Anna, I am so happy. And in that intro, you hit it right on the head when you said, this case, essentially this story, this Betty Willis case is not getting the spotlight and the attention and the justice it so deserves. So I got to thank you, and I know this is something that your audience can help amplify and spotlight. So I just got to thank you for having me on to talk about Betty.
I appreciate it. And, I always say to all of you that I try to read your comments, your emails, however you reach out. I can't always respond to everyone. But Joseph, you emailed me and you told me about this case, which I had not heard of. And I live in Southern California. And I read your article and I thought, wow, this is so fascinating. And we always, we want to make sure that we protect the underserved in our world, and they're always the most vulnerable. And this is a case of that. But I also think it's a case of so many of us have problems in our lives, and then sometimes you don't really see them. They become invisible. And the sadness of what happens when one of them becomes a crime victim, I think what makes this even more complicated is the sense that we all have a dream. And Betty got awfully close to her dream. And then maybe you'll be able to explain to us what happened and how she ended up on the streets and so vulnerable at that point.
It is the, $1 million question. I think one thing that this story has taught me is right off the bat, I think one thing that I was able to finally, it kind of continued to open my mind about. You see that person on the street, you probably saw someone today on the street. There's nothing you can come up with in your mind that is accurate. You just don't know. Don't look at someone and think that, this is, you just can't think that they're anything other than part of us and part of you and a grandmother or an aunt or a daughter or mother or son. It's another person out there who has a mom, who has a dad, who has a life, who has a story and a past and a future. And you don't know how they ended up there.
Also, the other thing is, when you look at someone, you don't know their story. You don't know their story. You will never understand where they got to and how they got there. And the thing I find so interesting about this case is, as I've said, Joseph, it has not received a lot of coverage. And so I'm curious how this got on your radar in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I've got a thing for kind of the untold story. I saw one of the second headlines coming in at the beginning of 2018, and it was, here in Southern California, where we both are, one of the local news headlines said, homeless woman murdered New Year's Day. That headline, within a matter of, I think, less than a week, within a few days, suddenly that headline had been enhanced, if you will, upgraded. I don't know a better way to put it. But suddenly it said, hey, by the way, that woman that we told you about, the homeless woman who was murdered, by the way, what a shocker. She has a history. She has a past. Again, like you said, just like all of us do. And this past included recording music, being a soul singer, pressing, releasing several albums. So to answer your question, Anna, why did this get onto my radar? I was traveling to Detroit, and as we were landing in Detroit, the headline that I was rereading was the memorial service for Aretha Franklin was about to happen. And suddenly Betty flashed to my mind because I'd seen Betty's story and Betty's face not long prior to that. And I thought, wait a minute, how does, here's one headline that says the Queen of Soul, this global lightning rod, this woman who only needs one name. And here's Betty Willis, who, isn't the Queen of Soul. But as we landed there in Detroit and the Aretha Franklin Memorial was happening, I was looking at these headlines and I was just going, okay, it goes back to that question, right? How do some people have all the luck? How do some people make it and shoot to the stars, And some other people can be just as unlucky. And that was kind of the case in most of Betty Willis's life and death.
And also it continues beyond her death because part of the problem is after all these years, this case is still stalled. And so justice, well, it hasn't quite been denied yet, but justice for sure has been delayed. I want to play a little clip from Betty's music, because as part of your research and part of the reporting you've done, you've kind of really helped to spotlight music that isn't ordinarily available to people. So we're going to play a short clip for everyone. This is from Act Naturally.
They're gonna put me in the movie. They're gonna make a big star out of me.
I feel like those lyrics are so autobiographical. It sounds so much like Betty's life, especially, that line where she sings, "We're going to make a film about a girl that's sad and lonely."
There's another song out there that people can find, "Someday You'll Need My Love." And in that song, Betty sings, "One day you'll look around and I won't be there." And so, of course, as we all know, things just seem to take on different meanings or hit you in a different way when, someone's gone. And I think from what I can tell, Anna, with my research with Betty Willis, it does seem like there was a lot of sad and lonely, maybe more sad than lonely. She was a kind of independent, just someone who she didn't seem needy, if that makes sense. She didn't. Mm-hmm. She seemed like Betty could stand on her own. But yeah, you hear the lyrics and I think you go, oh my gosh, I don't know if Betty knows this, but it sounds like she's singing, about herself and her life.
So let's talk about a little bit of the case itself. On January 1st of 2018, Betty Willis was homeless and she liked to sleep in a particular doorway of a fabric store in a strip mall in Santa Ana, California, because that is where she apparently felt safe because there were also cameras there, which is very important. At 4:30 in the morning, a woman who lived nearby stood out to have a cigarette, heard some commotion, some screaming, calls 911. This, to me, is the most incredible part of this case. So as the officers pull up, the alleged killer, was making a run for it, literally with his pants down, and he was arrested, and that was 2018. That was several years ago. Arrested was 22-year-old Rosendo Peck, a recent immigrant from Guatemala. There was surveillance video of the attack, in addition to what the police officers saw as they arrived on the scene. Isn't that why Betty chose that spot? Because of surveillance? So she felt safer and because it was well lit?
it may end up being what gets her justice. The fact that there was that video camera, it kind of gives me chills now just thinking about that. She, just for those people out there who are never going to meet Betty, let me tell you something. Betty approached the owner of this business in Orange County, California, and she went up to him and she basically said, "Look, I'd like to sleep here, and here's why." And she pointed out the cameras and she pointed out the lights. She goes and she seeks out a spot that she knows is going to be best for her, and she's thinking this whole thing through. So yeah, cameras were rolling that night on December 31st and January 1st, 2018.
That is so sad. And did she have some kind of relationship with the store owner who permitted her to sleep there?
Yeah, she sure did. Just a friendship. Just a, hey, it's Betty. Apparently everyone in the neighborhood knew of Betty. Not from her music, of course, and we'll get into that. A lot of people didn't know about her music, including local media, until a blogger shows up and says, "Hey, look at this YouTube." But Betty was a friendly lady, and she, got to know the people in her neighborhood. Again, like you are in your house right now, I am in my house right now. We get to know people in our neighborhood. Maybe Betty didn't have a house. Maybe Betty didn't want a house. Maybe you don't get it. That's okay. It's not for you or me to get. But just like what you and I do in our neighborhood, we know people. We get to know people and we say, "Hey, can I do this? Can I do that?" And that's how she got to know this gentleman that owns La Amiga, the fabric store in Santa Ana.
And it was with his permission that she was able to sleep there at night, but I think he had some conditions on when she had to be out by, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So she, and he said, the owner of the fabric store, Anna, said, Betty was always so great at kind of, I guess, just being respectful and knowing boundaries, knowing that, yeah, it's not going to look good if I go sleep in front of this doorway in Santa Ana of this fabric store as the customers are coming in and out. So Betty would always wait. She was mindful of that. She would wait 15, 20 minutes after closing to set up she would pop up her little bedside table that she carried with her in a cart. And she'd have her, just get all her stuff ready where she would bed down. And this was Betty's home for the night. And before dawn, most mornings, before dawn, she would be up and out and moving on with, heading to the local community center, just getting on with her day. And that's why I think she had such a great relationship with the family-owned fabric store, because in fact, the fabric store owner said he told me, Anna, that he felt that the store was actually a little bit safer when Betty was there, because he could count on a report in the morning. So he would go over and Betty would say, "Hey, just so you know, this guy did that, or I saw this over here," or they just say hello to each other. So he felt safer knowing that Betty was there, kind of keeping an eye out.
Before we go into the details of what's going on with the trial and what the delays have been, I want to understand Betty's life a little bit better. So Betty was a working studio singer in the 60s, but by the 70s, those gigs were starting to dry up. Like, how did she end up in a recording studio to begin with?
Betty's always been, her family is a family of musicians. She's always been into music. That's just been her thing. Part of what you're asking is, how'd she get on a record? How'd she get into the studio, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't know. But
it's fascinating.
Yeah, but she did. And again, I'm still looking at Betty's story. So I hope that we'll eventually, continue to learn more about, okay, there are these, okay, great, but how did you sing with this person? How were you on Phil Spector's label? How did that happen? And
so can you give me an idea of the range of music, or for how long, or how many records? Just give me an idea of what her career was like.
A lot of times, Anna, when you find a Betty Willis record, it's a single with one A side and one B side, not a full LP, not a full record. A lot of times when you find one of her albums, it'll say DJ copy or advance copy, showing that it was a promotional copy handed out to radio stations. So another mystery with Betty Jane Willis is there was no discography or All Music or Wikipedia or IMDb back then. And if you didn't really hit the radar, there's just understandably not much of a record, if you will, of what you've accomplished, even the small minor accomplishments along the way. So really with Betty, what I've been able to piece together is a whole bunch of singles. I'm unaware of any actual full release with a whole full album, but lots of singles, lots of guest appearances, backup work we'll never know about, backing vocals. There could be big songs we hear with Betty in the background. We just don't know because she's not credited. But she would go in and she would, get paid maybe $50 to cut the song, maybe less sometimes. She'd cut the song and would never see, anything more of that money, which is, kind of blows our mind today with how the recording industry is. And she would sometimes never even see the record. Can you imagine that? It was just people were just laying down music. They were just making music. If you made it, obviously, it'd be a full album and we'd hear more and she'd have copies. But if you didn't make it, you just move on to the next thing, move on to the next session.
Yeah, I mean, I had not heard of her, but that absolutely doesn't mean anything. So when the music career was no longer working, she ended up working at the post office.
Right.
So tell me a little bit, fill in the gaps here about, I believe she had a daughter, about her personal life and working at the post office.
So Betty's family came to California when she was 2 years old. And this is the 1940s. And she came out to California, and her family, their background was in farming. So rural Mississippi, comes out here kind of down in the Fresno area. And Betty makes her way up to some of her family. They kind of start to settle here in Southern California, in Orange County and in the Santa Ana area. And that's kind of where Betty started connecting with musicians. What Santa Ana is today and what it was back then in terms of music and black music is a bit different. Mm-hmm. Back then it was a go-to place. It was a place to be when you wanted to jam out. Aretha Franklin.
I can't even believe that. I mean, I look at yes. Santa Ana today and I'm like, really?
I know. It's just, it was the place to be. Aretha Franklin was at this jazz club that doesn't exist. It's been interesting. Thanks to Betty, I've been able to find out all this cool stuff that was happening back in the day in Santa Ana, California. Betty, as you know, and as you played one of the songs, she released a handful of singles, had some minor success, but it wasn't going anywhere. It just right. wasn't, it wasn't registering. And that's when Betty kind of got to a point in her life where this is about in the 1970s where she found herself pregnant. She was unmarried at that time. That was significant. She was unmarried. She was pregnant, and she was not seeing anything happen with her music career. So by the 1970s, at some point in the 1970s, she does what I think we've all done at some point. Maybe we'll do it in the future, where we go, okay, can't do that anymore. I'm going to have to come back to that, or it's just not going to work out. It's not my day. It's not in the cards. She heads over to something that is the opposite of music, which is reliability, the opposite of the entertainment industry, which is like structured U.S. Postal Service. And she goes there, and she ends up having a long and quiet career as a postal worker in Santa Ana.
That's incredible to me. She's working at the post office, and you mentioned she was pregnant, so she ends up having a baby. Tell me a little bit, is it her daughter?
Yep. So she has her daughter, Stephanie, and I've met with Stephanie several times, and Stephanie's the one still here for her, and the one still her one and only child, by the way. Still showing up at these court hearings, still doing everything she can to, get justice for Betty in whatever form that may be. But it sounds to me from what I've gathered from Betty's daughter that Betty was a great mom, a strong woman. You know, some people say she was friendly, some people say she was feisty. And when I ask the other one if the other is true, they say both. Friendly and feisty, that nice mix, that nice combination that's sometimes so necessary in this world. But yeah, basically, Anna, the 70s were all about raising her daughter and going from soul singer to postal worker.
Now, you write in your article that while she's at the post office, someone figures out who she is. And that person kind of becomes instrumental in gathering her music. Share that with us.
Wow. This part still gives me chills because I think that what you have is you have someone who has shown up at a job because they had to. And and what I mean is the type of job. We all have to work, but you know what I mean. She's shown up at this type of postal service job. And maybe not always in the best of moods, maybe not always loving her job. And then like a bolt of lightning, here comes this 18-year-old, friendly, excited, maybe never punched in on the time clock once in his life. And it's like, oh, here's my summer job at the post office. He's got all the energy in the world and all the excitement in the world. And this young man named Anthony. And so this young man shows up and is partnered with Betty. They're coworkers at the local post office in Santa Ana, California. And they're complete opposites. And what connects them is the day that they are assigned to sit there and sort mail. Here's Betty, here's Anthony, and they're sorting the mail, and they've got this kind of divider up between them. Postal Service doesn't want anyone to talk to anyone. Just do your work. Let's get it done. And Anthony can't help but, I'm sorry, but he needs to talk, and he's going to talk, and he's going to have a conversation, and he's going to make this interesting. And he made it interesting. I don't think he had any idea what he was doing, but he brought up to Betty. He said he had a record collection, and they started talking about music. And Betty says to Anthony, she says, and again, get the visual, they're sorting mail. Mundane day is the idea I'm getting here. And she says to Anthony, well, you know, I recorded some music. And he goes, oh, what do you mean you recorded some music? What are you talking about? She said, I released some albums, some records. He goes, really? He says, what was a song that you did? Sing me one of your songs. She was like, I can't get the visual. The post office. Who are you? You just started. I don't even know you. What's going on here? You want me to sing for you? Well, Anthony's very sweet, and he sweetly persisted. And next thing you know, this sorting the mail thing is now like a back office 1980 karaoke moment between this beautiful black woman and this little white kid showing up, and they're just, you know, singing. They're just turning it into anything other than a routine post office day. And at some point, Betty stops singing, and they're singing the song Act Naturally, the one I think that you played earlier. Yeah. They're singing the song, and Betty stops, and she says, how do you know that song? And he says, well, I have the record because, the record of the soul. Oh my God. You're Betty Willis. It was a moment where he goes, I have your record.
That's impossible.
I can't believe it. I hate to be cheesy saying it gives me chills, but really saying it out loud, hearing this story and thinking about Anthony telling it, it's just like, oh my gosh, these are things that don't happen every day. But wow. that's how, and Anna, it was in that moment right there that summer of 1980, where these two unlikely characters got linked up.
Wow. So Anthony, who actually has one of her records and is, how has I guess I should ask, how is Anthony able to find more of her music, and how does Anthony stay in touch with her or not through the years?
Sheer determination. You know, when you, and I think your listeners can identify with this fixation and fascination. You find things you're interested in, you find things you're curious about, and you just don't stop. Stopping is not an option, right? And that was the case with Anthony, Betty's colleague at the U.S. Postal Service. Essentially, he's like, oh my God, I came here to like sort mail and, put stamps on things and whatever. And guess who I work with? I mean, no, she wasn't a known name. No, she wasn't a big name. But you know what she was? She was in his record collection, and that was enough for him. That just blew his mind. He went home. I don't know if this is in the Los Angeles Magazine article, but he went home that same day on his lunch break, went and gathered up some of his records, and he found the Betty record that he was referencing, the Act Naturally one. And by the end of the lunch break, had brought it back to the post office to say, look, I know who you are. There's one of those special moments in life where you realize, okay, there are stars, quote unquote. There are stars and special people all around us.
And they aligned. They clearly aligned here. So now let's go to the 80s, and we'll find our way back to Anthony. So we go from the 80s now to the 90s, and it's somewhere in the 90s that Betty ends up living on the streets?
So at some point in the 1990s, Betty took early retirement from the Postal Service. And one thing that I think people need to know about Betty is that when she made up her mind, she made up her mind. When she was done with something, she was done with something. When she felt that something just wasn't going to work, she did what I need to try to do more often. Just let it go, move on to something that will work, right? It's a sign of wisdom to be able to say, let me put this down and let me go do this. Betty was not a type of person who wanted to rely on anyone. She didn't want any terms or conditions linked up with her in any way. She wanted to do her own thing as much as she possibly could. How she ended up unhoused, how Betty ended up homeless is not 100% clear. Betty was, I think, maybe had been let down one too many times in life. Maybe things weren't working out personally and professionally. And maybe just life was, some of us are lucky. Some of us are blessed. Some of us have good things happening. Other people run into hard time and again. I think with Betty, she was just fed up, instead of just, continuing to attempt and keep going and drive herself mad by trying to make things work. She took early retirement, and just kind of didn't want to be a burden to anyone. And even though, keep in mind, Anna, she had a daughter, eventually had several grandbabies, would go with her daughter to her daughter would pick her up and go to the nail salon, go to the hair salon.
While she lived on the streets.
That's right.
Interesting. So
yeah.
she continued her family connection. Clearly, she had family who could help her. She retired early, so she had a pension. And by this time, she'd also have Social Security. So it doesn't sound like she was penniless.
Correct.
But
every night ended the same. Every night ended with dropping grandma, dropping mom, dropping Betty off at the park or wherever Betty wanted to be dropped off.
Interesting. Do you know whether there was any additional issues with either mental illness or any form of addiction?
I think that both of those came into play from time to time. I don't think it was one of the primary factors, believe it or not. You know what I mean?
No, I do. No, there are some people, people have the right to live their life as they choose. And it's interesting that she clearly had a support system, a family, a little bit of income coming in. And it sounds, based on what you're describing, that a lot of this was choice. And we may not fully understand it, but that is not our life to live. That is Betty's life to live.
Imagine being her daughter. Mom, come on, let's get you an apartment. We'll split it. I'll pay for this little cheap studio. Let's get you an apartment. No, the answer was no. So how do you get from an apartment or a home to the street. She did all sorts of little things in between in an attempt to kind of make life and living work for her. A minivan, living in a van, a little tiny RV she had for a while, a car at some point, and we're not talking about just transportation, we're talking about living in, and something would always happen. It'd be like, it would get towed because it didn't have the right registration or up-to-date registration, or it would have... Something always happens. So Betty reached a point, again, this is in the 1990s, where Betty Willis said, I'm done. I can count on me, and that's about it, and that's what I'm going to do.
So then, do people, obviously her daughter and her family, stay in touch with her, see her, and they're, still engaged and close and as supportive as possible under the circumstances? What about Anthony? Does Anthony stay in touch with her? Does he know that Betty Willis, the woman singing on his record, is actually now unhoused?
He doesn't know. He doesn't know right away. He doesn't know for some time. He doesn't know until just a few years ago, by the way.
When she passed or before she passed?
Shortly before she passed. And a few years before she passed. And, but what he does do is he keeps thinking about her, Anna. He keeps thinking about her. And she... go through the records and, oh, Betty, I wonder how Betty is. They lost touch. All he knows, she was shifted to a different location, or vice versa. He was shifted to a different location at USPS. And just like so many of our colleagues and friends, you lose touch from time to time. At some point, someone's, after Anthony asked randomly, he's asking coworkers occasionally, like, hey, any update on Betty? Have you heard from her? And one guy said, well, she's living over, and he describes an area. And Anthony was a little bit unfamiliar with the area. He said, wait, where? And the person said, well, she's living on the street. So she hangs out at this park. And he's kind of just like, what? Really? But keep in mind, the character I described earlier, Anthony, that personality, they're doing karaoke in the back of the post office, essentially. He kind of compartmentalized that, intel that he had just received about, oh my God, Betty's homeless. And he kind of focused on, well, tell me more. Where is she? Where is this location? Where can I go find her? Because I wanted to check in on her and see how she was. So this was in approximately 2015, maybe 2016-ish. Again, Betty Willis was murdered January 1st, 2018. So 2015, 2016, approximately. Anthony, the former colleague, now in his 50s, no longer 18 years old, he makes it a mission to find Betty. He just wanted to, YouTube had come around, and he wanted her to know that he was, uploading some of her music onto YouTube, and people were listening from all over the world, and she was having hundreds of thousands of streams. He was going to go explain that to Betty and explain what a stream was and what it meant, and he was just going to go fan out with his friend. He'd been looking for some time, circa 2015, for Betty, and he was finally guided. Someone at a community center also gave him a little more guidance and said, there's this tree in this park, and she always hangs out there. She's always hanging out there. Go try and find her. So he goes there, and he's not lucky. He goes back a few days later, and he's like, am I going to find Betty Willis, my old colleague, my old friend? And he's driving around, and he sees this woman under a tree, and he's like, that's not Betty. There's no way. I can't be this lucky. Is that really Betty? He drives up, and he leans in, and something to keep in mind is that when Anthony and Betty first met, just to get a clear picture, Betty often wore sunglasses inside. She was that kind of diva. So
she was that kind of postal worker. Mm-hmm.
That kind of postal worker, yes. So she had shades on inside. That's the one. And so as Anthony, years and years later, drove up and saw this woman underneath the tree, he's like, there's no way that's Betty. That just can't be Betty. And then he saw the shades. He saw the sunglasses. And he said, he rolled down the window. He leans out the window and he says, Betty? Betty Willis? She looked up. It was Betty. They had a bit of a reunion. It was a really cool thing, and just turned out to be such a, I guess, blessing, considering what unfolded in the just few years that would follow. But he said, "Oh my God, I can't believe I found you." And here he goes, the same excitement he had back at 18 years old in 1980 down in Orange County, California, when he first met Betty Willis, the postal worker, not the soul singer, but the postal worker. And so essentially he says, "Hey, come on, get in the car. I have something I want you to hear." He had burned a CD, and I know you're young true crime people may not no one caught on fire. Explain this to them.
Right. That's right.
So he made this CD, he downloaded this music so she could hear it. And so this is approximately 3 or so years prior to Betty's murder in 2018. And there they are, two strangers back at it again. It's, a fan and a soul singer, or a post office worker and a former colleague, but whatever you call them, they're sitting in the car. It's Betty Willis and her long lost friend Anthony. They're listening to Betty Willis, and he turns up the music. He says, "Do you remember this?" And she has a moment. She goes back, and Anthony describes that it was a day he'll never forget. It was one of the most special days of his life, because he feel like he kind of tapped into whoever Betty was, the
door opened.
The door opened.
And so Betty's now being, she may know or she may not know, but that she's having this little resurgence, and that people on YouTube around the world are interested in her music. I'm fascinated by that. So did that change her trajectory in any way?
It's interesting that you asked that. I'm glad you asked that, Anna, because there was something that did happen in the 1980s where Anthony, the friend, described to me that Betty was trying to get an attorney to try and figure out, what her rights were in terms of this song or that song. Because keep in mind, even though you may not know the name Betty Willis, there's still compilation CDs, especially in Europe and in the UK, even here in the United States, these box sets of, titles like Soul Divas or the 100 Best or 100 Lost Soul Songs or whatever. And look closely enough on those CDs or on those releases, and you'll see Betty Willis. So still to this day, even just about 2 years ago, a new pressing of a song that Betty Willis was the lead singer on was released, and a record label and a whole bunch of management companies obviously made some money off of this release. So Betty did look in the 1980s at kind of doing that, but things never panned out. And I think by the time that Anthony had, reconnected with her around 2015, and that in the car as they're jamming out to Betty Willis, I think she had kind of, it's my sense that she had reached a point where she was now just enjoying the moment.
Yeah, she wasn't going to chase that anymore. I can kind of understand that. I do, the dreamer in me likes to think that at least for that moment, she realized that her voice was being heard in a way that she never thought would be. And so that is kind of magical in its own way. And I do love the fact that even though we're reporting about a crime case and talking about a trial, that within that conversation, there is the opportunity to hear Betty sing and to maybe put some focus on that, which I think is just amazing. It's just really amazing. And we are going to link to your page and to the YouTube channel that's got her music for those of you who want to hear more. So now I really want to get back. I want to get back to the case and the murder. So there's an arrest. There is a suspect. There is video evidence. There are the police arriving on scene and catching this person. I was reading that he's had something like 6 public defenders. So I'm sure, and I know we had the pandemic in the middle of all this. So we do know that lots of cases were slowed down because of the pandemic. But I'm finding that many cases are already back in court. So what the heck's going on with this guy?
I've gotten this sense, and I can only tell you in my meetings and conversations with Orange County, the district attorney's office, my limited conversations, I should say, very limited conversations, but those interactions, I've gotten the sense that it's not just COVID. It's not just delays. It's not, it seems to me, and again, want to just preface one last time, the sense I'm getting, it just doesn't matter enough. It's just not important enough. It's just
not a priority.
Not a priority.
Okay. That happens all the time in the justice system. There's not a thing we can do about that. These are the cases that are not the priority, but everyone deserves justice. Every case should be a priority. Let me ask you this. Where is this in the system? Is there a trial date?
Yes, but Anna, there's been a trial date before, and before that. There is a trial date on the calendar, as they say, for the first week of January 2023.
Okay.
Yep. And so we'll stay tuned to that. Some of the delays have had to do with the suspect, 22 at the time, immigrated from Guatemala. English is not his first language. And I'm going to say this wrong because I forget how to pronounce the specific dialect, but it's not English. Let's say this: it's not English and it's not Spanish.
So he's saying he has an ancient dialect or very specific dialect that he needs an interpreter for, and he's claiming that Spanish isn't going to be sufficient, even though there have been conversations that have been held with him in Spanish.
45-minute conversations.
But he claims, even though there are these conversations in Spanish, and we have many Spanish interpreters in the court system, along with many other languages, but he's claiming he needs a very specific dialect interpreter who is hard to come by here in the United States or hard to come by here in California.
You're correct. Someone who's been flown in occasionally, a specialist flown in from out of state into California, and zoomed in.
Can I just say, I really do feel after 6 public defenders and at least some form of evidence that appears that he is fluent and can comprehend at least one language, it just sounds like someone's playing the system here. I'm sorry, that is my personal opinion.
This guy was caught, this 22-year-old man was caught on camera in the middle of the night raping and ultimately allegedly murdering this 76-year-old grandmother, caught on camera. They've got the footage. Police arrived within minutes. Police were there. What did they do next? And they handcuffed him. Then they talked to him for nearly an hour in Spanish. Literally caught with his pants down. I mean, do you see the confusion?
No, it's beyond confusion. It is what I believe is someone working the system. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Everyone is entitled to proper representation, a fair trial. Let's get to that trial.
Yeah.
Let's get to it. Let's just get to it.
Yeah, for Betty and for him.
Let's just do it. I can't imagine he wants to continue being incarcerated. And I just think that there can't be any more delays. This is absurd. It is time to get on with this.
I think it's time to get on with it. I do want to share with your listeners something that's kind of just haunted me, but also, Anna, it's also just kind of made sense. That night that 911 calls came in, multiple 911 calls came into Santa Ana PD saying, I'm hearing, it sounds like a woman is being attacked. What's interesting to me, and the 911 callers describe, someone crying out the word help, help. And what's so interesting is that what ended up not working for Betty was her voice. And what ended up saving Betty was her voice. And I just think that's the most interesting thing. It was that voice that cried out at the end, that Betty Willis voice that saved her in the end, saved her in terms of potentially getting justice, saved her in the sense that someone was able to pick up the phone, call 911 because Betty wasn't going down without a fight.
Let's hope that 2023 is the year that there is justice for Betty. Joseph, I want to thank you for being on the program. I hope that you'll keep us updated on what's going on with the case. Just shoot us an email so we know, and we can always include it in True Crime Daily, the podcast, if this finally does go to trial, which I believe it will.
And I know you're going to link to josephfenity.com/Betty. But I just want to tell you, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. This case of Betty's has had the worst luck in being spotlighted, and her voice deserves to be amplified. And I'm so appreciative that you're able to introduce everyone to Betty. And I think fingers are crossed that there's justice for Betty Willis really soon. So thank you for having me on and talking about Betty.
Thank you for covering this. Thank you for reaching out. It's been our pleasure to have you on here, Joseph. As we said, we will link to your website. We're going to link to the YouTube channel that's got Betty's music so you all can enjoy it. I hope that we'll have a good update in the following year, that there has been some justice here or a resolution of some sort, because she deserves that. You can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the rest of our podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can receive our newsletter at truecrimedaily.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Ana Garcia. This has been a special edition of True Crime Daily, the podcast. And as we always say, don't do crime.